Hey, everybody. How's it going? It is nice to be here. Really, really nice to be here. It has been a hot minute since we've done this. I got to tell you that this semester had it out for me pretty hard. It's been tough on the other side of going back to in-person instruction. I got to tell you, it was bad in the fall. The spring has just had everything sort of mounted on top of it. A lot of students having a lot of troubles, a lot of committee stuff. But you know what? None of that matters right now. Cheers! It's good to see everybody. That's good enough. Let's get a little bit more. Really, really glad to do this. A lot has happened since the last time we've gotten on here. I was just watching before we did this. Tucker Carlson is currently talking with somebody about raising their testosterone by sunning their genitals. So that's something that we're dealing with now. And, you know, it'd be a whole lot funnier if it wasn't building up to a giant neo-fascist authoritarian movement. So we got that going for us. So we got to deal with that. We got to talk about a lot of developments within the Republican Party, the war in Ukraine, some larger questions about neoliberalism and politics at the moment. We have so much to talk about. A couple things that have happened this week. Ruth Ben-Ghiat was kind enough to have me do an interview over on her Lucid Substack. And then I joined with her subscribers and did a Zoom call that was supposed to last for 20 minutes. And we did it for like over an hour, which was really, really nice. Really good group of people. It's made me think about possibly doing some of these with my Substack, Dispatches from a Collapsing State. Thinking about possibly maybe this summer, as I'm not teaching classes, as I'm trying to do some writing and stuff, maybe trying to do some pretty regular sort of hangouts, maybe not Sunday nights at 8, trying to figure out when to do these and how to do it. But yeah, I had a really good time. I enjoy hanging out with people. So it's been really, really nice. Before we get going, I got to say that there has been an interesting wrestling with Elon Musk over the past couple of days. We have seen our media try desperately to explain what Elon Musk cares about and what his ideology is. And certainly, I mean, it must be about free speech. That's what this whole thing is about, which is horseshit. That's not what his attempt to buy Twitter is all about at all. It's about controlling information, and it's about controlling vectors of communication. It's really, really problematic, and also even more terrifying when you have billionaires who can sort of reach between their couch cushions and find the money necessary to take over like one of the biggest means of communication in the country, or the world for that matter. We have seen with Jeff Bezos, obviously, that Bezos and Musk are competing over who can get into space and create an interstellar species, which neither one of them is going to be able to do. But, you know, it's a great excuse for allowing people to continue to plunder our natural resources and never, ever pumping the brakes whatsoever when it comes to global climate change. Which I gotta say, it's kind of amazing, isn't it, that we were reaching a point of no return with climate change. The main thing that we need to address is how our militaries and empires use fossil fuel and how that affects our climate. And somehow or another, capital produced a new crisis. So instead of moving away from fossil fuels and taming down the military-industrial complex, instead now we're building them all up. Win-win, everybody. Win-win. And now we're just throwing a bunch of money and armaments at a situation that's going to get worse and worse by the day. But don't worry, Elon Musk, who has never actually created a single product, I mean, you got some, I don't know, internet pay situations that may work occasionally. Basically, it's not created any products that actually work, hasn't actually gotten us any closer to being an interstellar species. Is just basically a more seemingly competent Donald Trump in the new age than anything else. But, this is a guy who should have complete unimpeded control over culture. Meanwhile, our media is just consistently trying to understand who these people are and trying to project onto them something more human. He obviously cares about this free speech. No, what he cares about is gobbling everything up and realizing his libertarian dreams, which aren't even technically libertarian. He wants to destroy government so it doesn't get in the way of his plundering of resources and amassing his personal fortune, growing and growing and growing. And, on top of that, it's a matter of, it's just a matter of basically doing whatever you want at any given moment, allowing for this government that you hate so much to supplement all of your losses, basically to create corporate and personal welfare for yourself while claiming that you're all for libertarian principles. It's awful. John just said the media treating everything that Trump tweets about before as newsworthy, which was its own trap. It just absolutely hacked our media and gave him billions and billions of dollars of free advertising, which is inevitably what would happen if he's allowed back on Twitter or if our media continues to go down the self-destructive path that they are on. It's a lot of fun stuff. But we're going to talk tonight about all this, but we're also going to talk about hope. We're going to talk about strategies. We're going to talk about things to keep in mind as we do all of this. So first things first, before we get to the questions, cheers to all of you. Thank you for hanging out with me on a pretty beautiful Sunday night in southwestern Georgia. It just dropped about 20 degrees, which means there's a storm coming through that will probably hit as I'm doing this bourbon talk, which those of you who tune in regularly, you might notice that a regular occurrence of bourbon talk is to do this as a storm rages. I don't know what it is about our timing, but it works pretty well. Tom says, okay, somebody has to ask, but what's up with that strange Tucker Carlson video of naked men chopping wood? Well, first of all, Tom, I really appreciate that you phrased it like that, naked men chopping wood. It is a strange little preview that was running around talking about what has happened to men and what's going to happen to men. Right now, he is talking to somebody about, again, raising testosterone count by artificially sunning their genitals. It's an absolute absurd thing, and we all got our decent laughs off of it. But I want to point out, and this is something that we have to talk about on here because it's something that I've researched and I've been able to put together. The masculinity part of this that the national conservative movement is pushing. And we see this with, you got your Tom Cottons, you got your Josh Hallway. Now, of course, you've got it with Tucker Carlson. You're going to see it with all of the Republicans. This is going to be another part of this offensive in terms of rhetoric. They're going to absolutely go after gay and trans people. They are going to be spotlit. They are going to be oppressed. They're going to be hunted down before this whole thing is all said and done. This weaponization of the idea of masculinity is unfortunately pretty predictable. I've been talking about this for a little while, but it is about making men feel as if they need to double down in their masculinity, which is the entire purpose of masculinity as a gendered identity in the first place. It's supposed to make men feel insecure in their own skin, make themselves feel like they can never live up to the masculine ideal because it's impossible and it's absurd and it's contradictory. They're not supposed to have feelings. They're not supposed to communicate. All of that was created by industrialization. The idea that men were supposed to go into a factory and sacrifice their well-being in order to pay for, the lives of their families and their children. That entire gendered identity was based around that. Now that we are on the other side of industrialization with globalism, we are now seeing this be weaponized for a lot of different purposes. And part of it is it's partly the culture war. It's partly the idea that gendered roles are under attack and the patriarchy must be reinforced. But also, it's an attempt to start to sanctify the idea of industrialization. And by what I mean by that is, I want to speak very quickly about where all of this is going. I've talked a little bit on the Muckrake podcast about this, but globalization, it sent industry elsewhere to where people had to work for cents on the dollar. They had to work beyond regulation, right? Um, they had to go and they had to toil and basically engage in sweatshops and slave labor. That, for the longest time, was meant to create in America a consumer society. We were supposed to be at the top of the food chain. We were the tastemakers. We were the ones who decided what everyone was supposed to purchase, what culture was supposed to be like. Well, guess what? Those trends and moves, they never, ever stay consistent. So what's going to happen is it's going to boomerang around. Now that we have reached the point where capital has so dominated our state of government, it now owns our politicians. It has more or less completely depowered the federal government to do anything while eating away at liberal democracy, while disenfranchising, while using conspiracy theories to protect themselves and to push pro-free market, not even actually free market, but to push, pro-wealth legislation, particularly in these red states. We're going to reach a point where all of a sudden people are going to want to have industry back in the United States of America. And in order to do that, you first of all have to get rid of things like the minimum wage. You have to get rid of child labor laws. You have to get rid of the regulations in the workplace that are supposed to keep us safe. This process started decades ago when they absolutely destroyed organized labor. Well, now, and this is what fascists, neo-fascists, you name it, authoritarians, they always do. They take what they want to do and they wrap it in this fancy wrapping paper of ideology. And they say, hey, you know what? It probably sounds terrible going back into the factories and sacrificing your body for pennies on the dollar. But first of all, you're a man. It's what you're supposed to do. Reclaim masculinity, which is going to be about working with your body and whatever happened to that. This is the reason why people like J.D. Vance are pushing this. Howley and Cotton and even Ted Cruz are pushing this idea of we need to bring back industry, particularly to the United States. So that's going to be part of it with national conservatism. They're going to push for the destruction of all these regulations, all these guardrails. And they're going to wrap it in the ideology of reclaiming masculinity. They're going to wrap it in the ideology of nationalism and religious purpose. And with all of that, what that means is the ideology of fascism is about creating a system in which, hey, listen, those people over there are trying to destroy you. But if you join us, if you put on the armband, if you do the goose step, if you are part of this movement, we will crush them. And there will be meaning in your life. And part of what has happened is that all meaning has been hollowed out in society for the most part. We still, some people still have faith. Some people hold on to things like Trumpism. Other people have, their own superstitions, their own coping mechanisms. But eventually, whenever capitalism is in trouble, the fascists come in and they sanctify it with a religious type ideology. That's where all of this stuff is going. This is why we're starting to talk about what men are and what men can be. By the way, white men. That's what this is all about. It's about white men reclaiming their culture, which, if some of you are old enough to remember, is exactly what Richard Spencer was selling with the alt-right. It's the exact same thing. And it's just going to go through this legitimizing cycle. So leading up to November for the midterms, we're going to see gay and trans people just completely targeted constantly. It's going to become the big satanic panic scare issue. We're already on that road. Wealthy billionaires and millionaires who fund the Republican Party are funding these organizations. They're using this to pass the legislation that they want. And it's just going to keep happening. It's going to happen in education. It's going to happen in labor unless we defeat this thing. And if we are able to defeat this thing, we might be able to find something new, something better, something realer. But what this is about is creating the foundation for where this stuff is going, where national conservatism is going, where this authoritarianism is going. And they're going to sanctify it. They're going to tell you a bunch of really, really fake bullshit mythologies about white men, Western civilization, and masculinity. And all of that stuff is what's going to eventually allow the wealthy and the powerful to further exploit people. I mean, that's where this thing is definitely going. Bobby says to me, I really wanted to believe you were wrong about Ukraine, Putin, and the West losing interest while this thing ground on. You and me both, Bobby. You and me both. I did not want to be right about that because it's terrible and tragic. Alas, the writing was on the wall. What comes next, and where is all of this leading? I just want to reiterate quickly that the Tony, I'll answer that in just a second. I think that's a good question. I'll get to that in just a second. I knew that Western culture was going to get its fill of the Ukrainian war and start to turn away. That was inevitable because of accelerated culture. For a few days, this was a very attractive story. It was one of the few things that people turned on cable news to actually watch. And if you looked on social media for a few days, there was a lot of signaling, of course, that people were with Ukraine and sharing a lot of memes and sharing a lot of videos and sort of engaging in that experience together. I think Vladimir Putin definitely thought that he was going to win this war within a few days, possibly a couple of weeks. I think that was the original plan. But embedded within that plan was the idea that Western civilization, Western powers, such as the United States of America, were so riddled with corruption and were so riddled with greed and selfishness and consumerism, quite frankly, that they would make a show of caring about this and move on, that maybe there would be some sanctions. But listen, the ruble has already rebounded. Russian banks have already rebounded. Europe has yet to kick the addiction of Russian oil because they're not going to. And on top of that, like, the Russians sort of created their own bypass of Western capitalism. They're still making a ton of money in Western capital, but China is basically going ahead and making sure that things are continuing pretty much unabated. Now, where do I see this happen? Where do I see this going? Right now, within Russia, Vladimir Putin is currently sort of culling his insider circle. And we're talking about a lot of oligarchs. We're talking about a lot of inside advisors and people who have been with him. You got Surkov, who is like absolutely instrumental in setting up Putinism and is reportedly under house arrest right now. Putin is absolutely terrified of a coup, which he should be. There are plenty of people within the Russian oligarchical community that would certainly love to assassinate him or see him, I don't know, fall out a window. But he is holding on to power as is. And I think what we're about to see is another round of atrocities and aggressions in eastern Ukraine, and probably widespread. We're going to continue to see thermobaric weapons. We're going to see chemical weapons. I would not put money right now on a nuclear exchange, but I mean, my God, the further that this goes on and the more that like this thing keeps growing and growing and growing as Vladimir Putin sort of has to fight for his life and his regime, who knows? But where this is going is that this is a precursor to a much, much larger crisis to come. We're looking at the possibility that France might fall into authoritarian hands. Marine Le Pen has a real chance at winning the presidency. Right now, I would probably bet my money on Emmanuel Macron getting reelected, but I mean, Le Pen is in the race. We could see France move in that direction, and Le Pen has already signaled, and we know this, is already totally fine with Russia and Putin. She relies on Hungarian money, which of course is Viktor Orban's backyard. She relies on Russian money and has already signaled that she'd be more than fine working within that circle. It's a lot like what happened here when Trump won. You notice that Trump all of a sudden started stiff-arming American allies, Western powers, and started really moving more and more towards authoritarians. That's what you could see with France. That's what you could see with the United States of America over the next 4 years. We're eventually going to see, as I was just talking about with this authoritarian movement, this thing is going to reach a moment. And there is a showdown that is just broiling right now between the United States and China over who is going to basically run the economic matters of the world, who's going to be at the top of that pyramid, so to speak. Unless we start coming up with alternatives, particularly with global climate change, this is going to be a precursor. And I hate to say that, but that's where this thing is. And it's really awful and it's really tragic, but something massive and world-changing is brewing up right now. The question is, what will that be? Now, real fast, Tony asked me what's up with the, I had it just up here. Tony had asked me what's up with the Catholics, this particular Opus Dei group and or Bourbon. And if you actually go back into the history, the Opus Dei were absolutely essential in running neoliberalism. And this goes back. France totally was nearly going fascist before World War II. And then during World War II, of course, Vichy France comes out. And it wasn't just, oh, wow, I guess the Germans are here. I guess we'll work with the Germans. There were people who were enthusiastic. I mean, they wanted to have concentration camps across France, and they were much more than collaborators. They saw that as just an absolutely divine miracle. France has incredibly fascist roots. You could even make an argument that proto-fascism found root in France before it found root elsewhere. I mean, that's an argument that you could have. Real fast, and I'll get back to Tony's question. Lacey says, I did a 20-page paper on it, but I still don't understand the allure of authoritarianism. The allure is the meaning. It's you reach a point in which you don't have trust in liberal democracy anymore. It has failed you. It's failed the people that you love. It has left you with no hope whatsoever. And then someone comes along and says, guess what? That system has failed. I'm going to fix it. And by the way, I know you feel alone. I know you feel powerless. But guess what? If you join this group, I promise you will find meaning and power there. That's the allure of authoritarianism. But the allure hides that it is an absolute suicidal spiral. Because what happens when authoritarianism takes over is that you have countries that are in decline and they just absolutely push into it, and they will kill and murder anybody that gets in their way, including their own. So back to the Opus Dei. They were absolutely essential when it came to neoliberalism. You have like the Spanish Civil War, where all of a sudden the Catholic Church is like, absolutely go after the leftists, do whatever you have to do, take their children, slaughter them. And on top of that, we're going to help you set up an economic system. And here you have like Franco, who is working with these people to basically set up this new economic system that will go ahead and be authoritarian in nature, and it will be free market and oligarchical in nature. So it's not shocking whatsoever that they are totally fine with Bourbon. It is the nature of neoliberalism is to be fine with all of this. And I have to tell you that there are tons of neoliberals who would be absolutely fine with Bourbon or Orbanist institutions. They might not even know that they would be okay with it, but they would be totally fine with it. Martha says, what's your take on the New York City subway shooting? Number one, terrible. I said this on the podcast. I have a friend of mine who goes through that station all the time. And when I heard about it, I was instantly worried about him and his young daughter. I mean, that's the nature of living in America right now, is hoping that the people you love and care about aren't going to be caught up in some sort of mass shooting or pandemic or, terrible, terrible tragedy. But I think the other important thing to remember about all this is that New York City has an army of police officers. They have a security state apparatus that is basically second to none outside of China. They supposedly weren't able to catch video of this happening. They weren't able to catch the person for hours and hours. that security state that we spend so much money towards. And I don't care if it is police, I don't care if it's the military, I don't care if it's the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, you name it. All of the money that we spend on this stuff, we spend it on this stuff in order to have the illusion of control and safety. It does not help. It really, truly doesn't. It creates a situation where maybe they'll react to crimes and maybe they'll go and arrest the people who are doing it. But I mean, my God, this thing happened in supposedly one of the safest cities in the world. And we know that that's not true. It's this fiction. It's this mythology that continues to get told. I mean, they are more or less an occupying army within New York City. And they weren't able to stop this, and they weren't able to find the guy. I mean, it is... It's a real mess. Bernadette, what do you think the chances of the orangutan, Donald Trump, for people keeping along at home? What do you think the chances are that he'll run again, or do you believe he's just running the grift until the deadlines to get on state primary ballots? That's a hell of a question. The $64,000 question. Right now. And here's the thing with Trump. This is the damnedest thing about Trump, is that he didn't want to really be president. He sort of backed into being president of the United States of America. Didn't want to do the job. Loved, of course, when people stood up and listened to Hail to the Chief, and he loved doing that whole rigmarole, the almost like being the marshal of a parade. That's what he enjoyed about it, right? And the idea that he was in charge and people sucking up to him and bribing him. He's more than happy to be an ex-president, except for the fact that the United States of America largely has tuned him out because he's been thrown off social media, and quite frankly, most people hate him. I originally thought that there was no way, shape, or form, if he was alive or healthy, that he wasn't going to run for re-election. Right now, if I had to put money on somebody, it would be Ron DeSantis. And that should keep some people up at night, because he's a terrifying individual. The state system that he has created in Florida, his ability to manifest these culture war ideas, and his willingness to go ahead and put his signature on these pieces of legislation that are oppressive and dangerous and reactionary. It's a lot. And I've been paying attention for a while to the entire sort of right-wing intellectual sphere, the people who are trying to take Trumpism and turn it into national conservatism. They love Ron DeSantis. He is their guy. The question is whether or not Trump will run, and if he does and DeSantis runs, what will happen on that stage? How will DeSantis be able to interact with him? And I think DeSantis has a nasty streak to him. I think we've seen it in places and in moments. So I could see him and Trump really butting their chest up against one another. But I have to tell you, the thing that Nick and I have been talking about on the podcast for a while, what I've been talking about on here for a while, the danger is a smarter, more disciplined, ideological Donald Trump, who has the support of not just the Republican Party and all of their operators, but also who isn't Donald Trump. And so the national media is like, he's not that bad. I mean, he doesn't say all the wrong things. He can dress himself. The idea that our media is going to be primed to want to line up behind a quote unquote respectable Republican nominee, that's terrifying. And if the military escalation and saber rattling continues, we've seen it time and again. What does our media love? They love getting behind the stars and stripes whenever there's a military endeavor, regardless of whether or not it's completely cooked up and unreal and part of conspiracy theories. They love that stuff. It is it's frightening. It's actually really, really frightening, the idea that Ron DeSantis could come in and do this thing, which is all the more reason why there has to be an alternative, why somebody somewhere has to start coming up with an alternative. Because just going out and saying, I don't know why we couldn't pass our agenda, get more of us elected and we'll pass it, that's not going to cut it. That's not going to cut it. But the more that we get into this militarism, this weaponized Christian nationalism, this masculinity stuff, the militarism, the more that all that stuff comes together, and the more that this system shows as designed that it's incapable of handling the problems of the moment, the danger grows and grows and grows. And that's where we are right now. But right now, my money would probably be on Ron DeSantis, but that could always possibly change. All right, I got two questions about the Jared Kushner Saudi thing. Which, by the way, do you know how much it sucks that Jared Kushner is also named Jared? Do you know how hard that is, carrying this name around? And people just saying Jared all the time and talking about, like, the awfulness that is Jared Kushner. It sucks. It absolutely sucks. I absolutely hate carrying around the same name as that dude. All right, so we got two. The first one is from America. Thoughts on the whole Kushner Saudi expose? I feel that Kushner is the biggest winner of them all and the scammers. And then Toonbach, we've become numb to a lot of craziness in the last few years, but Kushner getting a $2 billion bribe from the Saudis feels like it should be a bigger deal. Your thoughts? So, good Jared. I'll take good Jared. So I'll just say, first of all, the reason why this isn't a bigger conversation and the reason why this isn't being focused on is because Saudi corruption is just baked into the system. You're not, and I just want to take a second, and I want to make this very, very clear. I've said as much before, but I want to say it in so many words. When you read the papers, the magazines, the websites of the day, when you watch CNN, MSNBC, right? When you watch this stuff and read this stuff, you are not reading an unbiased account of what is happening. You are reading a tailored, decided on piece of rhetoric. And in all cases, whether it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, MSNBC, CNN, you name it, you are absorbing corporate talking points. You are absorbing stuff from a very, very specific class perspective. And a lot of this has to do with so-called realists, right? And a lot of it is neoliberal. The idea that, you know what, the Saudis are terrible. And yes, they're bad on human rights. And yes, they execute people all the time. And yes, they had something to do with 9/11. And yes, they've basically sided with Putin on this. But guess what? We got to work with the Saudis. And it doesn't matter what we do. We just have to continue to just smile and grin and bear it. And an important thing from all of this, and you all remember this, it was after Khashoggi being murdered and dismembered by the Saudis. Donald Trump came out and said, what do you want me to do? Cancel our contracts? Not take their money? And everyone was like, oh my God, isn't this disgusting? And yes, it was disgusting. But he wasn't saying anything that wasn't true and indicative of how the United States government deals with Saudi Arabia. As long as we are addicted to fossil fuels, and as long as we continue empire building, we are going to work with people like the Saudis. We are going to continue to absorb the corruption and the authoritarianism that comes from working and dealing with people like the Saudis. In all of this, you're not going to hear very much about it. There obviously was this big reveal that there was a $2 billion basically bribe to Jared Kushner. That's who he is. That's what he does. And he's the kind of guy that manages to walk through rain and come out on the other side dry. Why? Because he knows what he's doing in terms of corruption. The Trump administration was just the most overtly corrupt administration that you could ever imagine. And the reason that they did that is because the plate was set for them with neoliberalism. They just came in and they said, yeah, we'll take a bunch of money and we'll take a bunch of corruption and we're going to rub the people's nose in it. And it tells us, it's an important message. This is a Putinist message. We'll do whatever we want. What are you going to do, arrest us? You're going to prosecute us? Well, guess what? Over here, you can actually arrest us and prosecute us. But look, Roger Stone's walking around. I mean, he got a pardon. And Donald Trump, I mean, has broken pretty much every law in the books and is still, walking free today in Mar-a-Lago. The entire point is to let people know that there are two different systems. There's a system for the wealthy and the white, and there's a system for everybody else. That's it. And they love it. It makes them more powerful. And by the way, it makes you feel terrible. It makes you feel powerless, and it makes you less likely to stand up and call them out for what they're doing, because again, it makes you feel lonely. It makes you feel powerless. It makes you feel alone. And it makes you feel like, my God, I mean, this thing, there's nothing I can do. I can't possibly change anything. The worst thing I could do is say something about it, and I might get, attacked or persecuted, or possibly end up getting violence visited upon me, or get killed, or, the people I care about thrown in jail. It's really awful. Really, really terrible. But it's just outright corruption. That's it. And it's exactly what to expect from Trump and his family, and what to expect from something like Saudi Arabia. There's a reason you don't hear about it, and there's a reason it happens. This is a big question. And I wanted to talk about this and spend a couple of minutes with it. And this is something, going back to not just talking about what's happening right now and the symptoms of corruption and forthcoming collapse. But here's something that we need to think about. And here's something I want to spend a few minutes on. Jack Flowers asked, I feel neoliberal capitalism has depersonalized me in ways that are hard to identify. What questions can I ask myself to understand how I have been changed? So, what I'll first say is that neoliberalism has visited upon not just the question asker, Jack, but all of us, many, many evils. And on one hand, we've seen the people that we love suffer. Undoubtedly, we've been wronged by the system, whether or not that's because of healthcare or housing or law enforcement, or even just sort of cleaning up after disasters. There's people who are probably listening to this or watching this either right now or will in the next few days, who live in cities where they don't even have clean drinking water. And the reason is because neoliberals don't really, give a shit at all. So undoubtedly, we've had those evils visited upon us. We live in a nation that has been destabilized and corrupted by neoliberalism. It's allowed grifters like Donald Trump and Jared Kushner to run roughshod. It has also created a political and a media class that, quite frankly, has no interest in engaging with us whatsoever, and only provides the veneer of representation. And on top of that, we are facing a climate catastrophe, in part because neoliberalism has just absolutely proliferated around the world. And it makes it almost impossible to rein these people in or do something necessary and productive. Those are all evils that have been visited upon us because of neoliberalism. But going with Jack's question, this is on a personal level. And this is for me. This is for you. Everybody always says, what are things that I can do? And on one hand, you're not going to go over to Ukraine and solve the problem. You're not going to write an email to Joe Biden that is suddenly going to get rid of all this. And I'll do that because this is a big question. Nova asked me to define neoliberalism. I want to get this on the record because we always have new people who watch these videos. So here's a quick definition of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a political ideology that was cooked up in the early 20th century. It happened particularly in the 1930s as a bunch of political scientists and economists and philosophers. They looked at Nazism, fascism, communism, and also democracy. They looked at all that and they said, this is really, really dangerous. And the freedom of the individual that liberalism promises, and liberalism is based on protection of property, particularly white, wealthy property. So all of a sudden, if we start talking at this point in 1930s about neoliberalism, what we're actually talking about is we're talking about that the government should not be investing people's money in projects. They should be taking those tax dollars and making sure that the market is served and that the wealthy are served. It was meant to undermine democracy and mass politics all around. Neoliberalism wanted to get rid of labor unions. It wanted to get rid of regulations. It wanted to get rid of taxes. And it wanted to make sure that the markets and the wealthy were completely served. Now, this particularly took over starting worldwide around the 1970s. It was raised up in authoritarian states, whether or not that's Chile or Spain under Franco. But eventually in the 1970s, when stagflation takes over, all of a sudden the New Deal consensus that ran things, which said that the government, oh, Sarah, I'll answer that in just a second. That's a great question. The New Deal said, you know what, governments should be investing in human projects and taking care of its citizens, if only to sort of control capitalism and keep it from destroying itself. Neoliberalism came in and said that is absolutely ridiculous, and that is totalitarianism. So neoliberals come in the 1970s. It takes over in Great Britain and the United States of America, with Reaganism, by the way. And after the Soviet Union falls, it spreads throughout the entire world. And we reach the point where we have a globalist system in which corporations and the wealthy are basically enjoying unfettered power, and they have grown larger than the nation states that have birthed them. So right now, neoliberalism is within both the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. It is the main operating ideology of the world. And by the way, it's currently in real trouble, and people are coming to destroy it. Now, Sarah said, what's the difference of capitalism then? There's no difference. It's hyper-capitalism. Let capitalism go and let it do whatever it wants and let wealth consolidate. It basically says capitalism is the only thing that we could possibly ever trust. Let's let it go, and government should never, ever try and even bring it in and ever try and regulate it. That would be totalitarianism. So basically, neoliberalism and capitalism work together, and they create a system of hyper-capitalism. So, in the midst of all this, what has been pushed? It's a mythology of meritocracy. If you work hard enough, you'll make it, right? If you work really, really hard, and you're one of the talented, you will raise up and you will join the wealth class. On top of that, you should sacrifice yourself. I mean, 40 hours is what we're supposed to work, but shouldn't you work even more than that, right? Like, if you really want this. It also told us, you're supposed to spend your money on conspicuous consumption. You're supposed to have nice cars. You're supposed to have nice houses. On top of that, you and I are economic competitors. This is one of the ways that they undermine labor unions, but also any solidarity whatsoever. Neoliberalism led to a situation where, you might not know your neighbors. You might not engage in, civic duties. You might not go to City Hall for meetings. You might not go to your school board meetings, which is one of the reasons why the CRT and also this pedophile thing is happening, is to make sure that right-wing people, weaponized by paranoia, are going to go to these meetings and take them over on behalf of the wealthy. Oh, I agree, John. That's the problem, is that the liberal and neoliberal is confusing for people. And part of the problem is that we have not been taught what conservatism, liberalism, or neoliberalism is. Matter of fact, when you hear liberal, you think about a leftist, and that's not what a liberal is. A liberal is somebody who believes that, these systems are necessary, particularly to protect property, and that multiculturalism results as a result of these free markets and so on and so forth. Like, a liberal is not a leftist. A liberal is somebody who is engaging in these systems and believes that the system, if it works correctly, will continue to work itself. A leftist says, my God, we need to do something about these. These are very, very wired to privilege a certain class of people. Oh, Joe's in the house says, I don't understand what postmodernism is. That is a very long conversation. We can talk about postmodernism one of these nights, and we'll get real deep into it. But postmodernism is basically the idea that history has been compacted in a lot of different ways, and we all have different perspectives, and there is no baseline that everybody can agree on. Basically, we all live in different realities. It is a lot. There is a lot to discuss when it comes to postmodernism. So based in everything that I just said, what neoliberalism has done to us is it has, first off, disconnected us from other people in our communities. It's made us so focused on trying to make it financially and in terms of our careers that we oftentimes throw out our people, our families, our communities. And as a result, we become more and more isolated, and we feel that there's an alienation that comes from neoliberalism. On top of that, it convinces us that we are products, right? So like on one hand, here I am hanging out with you. I'm doing this live stream on, a Sunday night, hanging out with you all. And like, this is quote unquote part of my brand, right? And I'm up here, I'm doing this thing. I'm trying to sell my product, and I have products, and that's what we're doing here, or whatever. That is a level of a veneer of neoliberalism that is really, really gross. And even as you are trying, oh yeah, the financialization of everything. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second, actually. But you can have real, actual conversations and relationships. You can engage in intimacy. One of the things that I always think about is, before I started confronting this and before I started working sort of on myself and how I perceive the world, and I got to tell you that therapy helps with all of this. There are like moments where like something will happen and you're like, should I cry right now? I kind of feel like the correct response is to cry. And then all of a sudden you're like, am I crying because I'm supposed to cry or because I'm feeling something? There's a disconnection from ourselves to the lives that we live. Oftentimes we feel alienated from our own existences. Am I living off a script? Am I doing what's expected of me? Am I doing something because it's financially beneficial for me? And you can sort of live in a sort of bifurcated experience where what is real and what is authentic and what isn't. And if you're not careful within neoliberalism, you'll find yourself lost in that bifurcation. You'll wonder, am I doing something because I feel something, or am I doing something because I think the market and jobs and all of this expects me to do it? It has changed us. A term that people need to know is homo economicus. The idea is that capitalism, particularly this late stage capitalism that we're in the midst of right now and suffering through right now, has so changed us that it has created a new sort of species. We are so far beyond capitalism at this point that it couldn't possibly just walk away from it, right? And, Jennifer says we're living in a mental health pandemic, and we absolutely are. But that's what this is about. Neoliberalism is about taking each of us and just grinding us into the dirt, but making sure that you juice out every possible bit of profit and exploitation out of us. And in all of this, like, it is a matter of being disconnected from our humanity. It's about being disconnected from our own selves and being lost in a system of exploitation. The whole point of all of this is that you need to ask yourself certain questions, and you need to find yourself. For me, in terms of my therapy and my healing from all of this, it is about focusing on self. Like, what are the things that I actually believe? What are the things that I actually care about? What are the things I actually value? And then saying, you know what, these are things that I think I'm supposed to value, or things that I've been made to believe that I value. It's having to recognize yourself. And then once you recognize yourself, reaching out to others and reestablishing those bonds of intimacy and having real conversations with people, building communities, building solidarity, building trust, building those types of connective tissues. And when you're able to do all of that, all of a sudden, I got to tell you, neoliberalism is in trouble, because it demands that all of this stuff happens without us thinking about it. And it demands the crushing of solidarity. And in places where we've seen this troubled, and Chile is a really good example of it. Chile is where neoliberalism really, really took off and found its legs. Oh, the wellness industry is absolutely dependent on neoliberalism. And so is social media. Are you posting that thing because you believe it, you want to communicate it, or are you doing it in order to earn points, or are you doing it to earn money? So it takes away the authenticity, which keeps us from being able to build solidarity with other people. But if we're able to build solidarity, if we're able to find ourselves and then find others that we can communicate with, neoliberalism is in trouble. And that's something that we can do. That's a really, really, not just important, that is a vital thing that we have to do. That's a great question. Jane says, I'm taking time away for self-care so I will be good for fighting for our democracy later. Absolutely essential, because this is exhausting. It is an exhausting thing. And I have to tell you that authoritarians and fascists, they absolutely need you to be exhausted, and they need you to lose all hope. And that's the only way that they can win. You have to take care of yourself. What is my, Jane asked, what is my self-care? My self-care is doing stuff like talking to my mother. My self-care is remembering the stuff that matters. Taking moments. I said this the other day. I think I said it on the podcast. Like, I have this little dog that I love, and I was like out here rolling around in the grass with her. Neoliberalism tells us to never ever stop and smell the roses. You got to optimize yourself, right? You got to optimize every second of your life. Taking a second every now and then to rest, taking a second every now and then to roll around in the grass with your dog, to find the moments that replenish you. And therapy. I cannot recommend therapy enough. To work through the trauma that capitalism and neoliberalism have put us through, and that authoritarianism is putting us through right now. This is a grinding down of the individual. That's a big chunk of this. And if we're not careful, we are going to get ground down. We are going to lose hope, and we're going to lose any sort of facet of an idea that things could be better. And absolutely, it's important to find a good therapist, because there are some out there that are not great. But you got to talk about this stuff, and you got to have real conversations. You got to talk to people about actual issues. I keep saying this, but again, for anybody who's watching this for the first time, have real conversations with people that go beyond trading headlines, because so many people want to talk about politics right now, but they just sort of repeat back to each other headlines that they've heard. You need to have conversations about what's actually going on, how things feel. And when you have these conversations, what happens is that you start building solidarity of experience, because so much of this is about manipulating reality and telling us that you can't believe your eyes, you can't believe your ears, right? Just trust the authority. But we have to remember what truth is and what reality is, and we have to talk to some people. Penny says, what is the most optimistic thing you've seen recently? The most optimistic thing recently was the new Amazon labor union. And here's the reason why. That was in the face of so much money and effort and time on behalf of one of the most powerful corporations in the world. Amazon did not just let this happen. This was a necessary step to begin rebuilding labor. But also, I got to tell you something. There is, in the right-wing national conservatism, there is, and you'll notice if you listen to him, and Tucker Carlson does this stuff all the time. He even had the head of the union, the new union at Amazon, on his show the other day. There is an anti-corporate, pro-worker thing that the national conservatives do. They don't do it because they actually care about workers. They don't give a shit about workers. But they understand that there is energy and momentum. They understand that the energy and momentum is a revitalization of labor and the worker. National conservatives, much like Trump, they'll go on the left of an issue, the right of an issue, in the middle of the issue, all of them all at once if they possibly can. The only thing that matters is power. They don't have any actual principles, right? Even the national conservatives understand that the momentum right now is with the individual worker and with the idea for labor, union, and solidarity. That tells you that right now, everybody who is paying any actual attention to this understands that this is a growing thing. And by the way, you watch this stuff happen. There are major economic and labor shifts after things like a pandemic, but also Neoliberalism cannot crush labor unions forever if the people want them and desire them, because being exploited makes you want to change things. It is a natural cycle. The question is whether or not things can get changed, or whether or not they'll get fascists in the streets to crush our skulls, as we say that it needs to happen. Yep, was previously fired by Amazon. That was a great thing. I have a lot of hope and solidarity because people are tired of this. You reach a point where the human spirit says, no, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. Egan says, I read your interview with Ruth Ben-Ghiat about authoritarianism, offering alternatives to a dying system. What would other alternatives look like, and would they lead to altercations with those same authoritarians? First of all, if you are here from the Ruth Ben-Ghiat thing, go over and check out my Substack. It's Dispatches from a Collapsing State. I talk about this stuff all the time. The alternative to the dying system is what neoliberalism is trying to destroy. Neoliberalism is trying to destroy any sort of mass politics, any sort of organization of the people. All right? So, what we could have is a movement that starts to put power back in the hands of the people and returns government from its point of corruption and from its point of being bought and sold by these wealthy people and corporations. It returns power to the people and just leads to a point where, I mean, if we could even get to the point where we could get to a New Deal type situation where all of a sudden you have a government that actually responds to the will and the needs of the people, that's a huge victory. But neoliberalism sees that as a defeat. Matter of fact, not just a defeat, it sees it as just the worst thing imaginable. So neoliberals are going to absolutely embrace neo-fascism, or whatever we're going to call it at the time. That's where this is going. It will embrace all of that in order to protect itself. It will go ahead and make deals with, and already has, people like Putin or Bourbon, you name it. Neoliberalism is more than happy to work with authoritarians and fascists. What the alternative needs to be, it has to be something that returns power to the people and creates a government that is responsible to the people and responsive to their needs. It has to move towards a democratic apparatus in which normal people can run for government and dark money gets completely out of politics, if at all possible. On top of that, it has to be something that addresses global climate change, because we are reaching a fundamental breaking point with that, and it's only going to make neo-fascism and authoritarianism worse. It's science at this point. Why? Because as global climate change happens, you're actually going to see nations shrink. You're going to see land lost. You're going to see resources depleted. All of a sudden, you have more crises that have to be dealt with, including climate refugees, including displaced people, lost capital, lost property. Well, what happens then? Well, it's not like we're going to redistribute things. We're going to go further and further into neo-fascism and authoritarianism. There's going to be one of these strongman movements that's going to use white supremacy and patriarchal supremacy in order to navigate the problems. So you're going to have people put in camps, you're going to have people killed, and you're going to have things like martial law and the such, and that's where it goes. China took neoliberalism and used it as a weapon. Is what it did. It said, fine, that's totally fine. We will go ahead and supply you with these cheaply made goods, and we will slowly and utterly displace you. The neoliberals thought that China opening itself up for trade would eventually democratize and liberalize China. They were wrong. China went ahead and used its controlled capitalism as a weapon, and it did it in a really brilliant and brutal way, which I think, unfortunately, is a preview of where we might possibly be going. But yeah, I think the alternative's there. We could have I think even that much, like returning democratic power to the people, addressing climate change, I think that's just top of the barrel. I mean, at some point, where else we can go with it? But it will absolutely be opposed by totalitarianism and authoritarians. That's what they do. They will absolutely, crush skulls in order to protect what they have and their idea of future profits. Yeah, there's a lot of that. And But we don't have a choice. We have to find something else because this thing is melting down in a hurry. And to imagine that this is just going to perpetuate itself and move on is that's nothing short than misplaced faith, which is all neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism is an economic, societal, and political religious faith. What politicians are fit for the task, I don't think that we know them yet. I'll be honest with you. I don't think that those people have emerged yet. And hopefully this crisis is going to reveal them. But it's going to be on us to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Hey, we're about to an hour. We're going to count it down. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Cheers, everybody. For those who don't know, 1 hour. Finish what's in the glass and we pour some more. Thanks, everybody, for doing this. I always enjoy these things. I miss them when we don't. Miss it when we don't. Got to figure out the right schedule for this thing. I was working on the book, trying to get it done, trying to get the semester going. It's been got family stuff going on. It's been a rough few months is what it's been. But this is always, it re-energizes me, replenishes me. It's good for the community. I really enjoy this. So thank you for being here. All right, we got a couple more, or a few more, I guess I should say. Not a couple, couple's two. Tonight is George Dickel Barrel Select. It's all right. It's all right. Last one, I think, was about a month ago, maybe about a month and a half, something like that. But we'll do them more than that. We'll do them more regularly than that. We'll get back on a decent schedule. Jeremy says, Jared, how can we begin to find a baseline of hope in slowing down climate change when people like the NASA climate scientist Peter Kalmus and the Scientist Rebellion's public protests are largely buried or ignored or even sometimes slandered by the corporate media? Cheers. Well, first of all, cheers. Oh, Laura, no, that's right down here. I got it. I got that question. Don't worry about that. Laura asked a really good question. And I will say that somebody got smart and they thought that I wasn't going to answer it as if I was like some sort of a leftist, like liberal hack or something. Like I'm not afraid to talk about the corruption within the liberal sphere or the democratic sphere. It's absurd. And I've got an interesting little story to tell you about that. So no, Laura, don't worry. I've got that. So what Peter Kalmus and these scientists were doing was very, very heroic and really, really good. But I will say that the media is not interested in talking actually about climate change. Like, you know, they'll have an expert on every now and then, they'll cover it a little bit, but it's not an important story to them because they believe the system will figure itself out instead of actually dealing with the fact that it's capitalism that's killing us. Capitalism is what's keeping us from being able to fix climate change. What can we do about it? We've been told to recycle. We've been told to buy certain goods that, you know, if we make the right consumer decisions, like we'll stop climate change, don't worry. And that's not how this works. What needs to happen to stop climate change is that the nation state and with the nation state, all of their militaries and all of their production need to come to a consensus that number one, it's a problem. And number two, something serious has to be done about it. The market won't let that happen. At least the market as it works right now. They would much rather you believed that Elon Musk is going to make the rocket ship that's going to get us out of here, or Jeff Bezos is going to make the rocket ship, which, by the way, is a religious fantasy as well. They're not going to. In all of this, what has to happen is at some point there has to be a grassroots accountability movement, a grassroots democratic movement that says, listen, we're not going to vote for you people anymore as long as you're corrupt and as long as you do nothing about climate change. And it's going to have to be an awakening of democratic power. That's the long and short of it. They're not going to make this decision themselves. And it doesn't matter how many natural disasters there are. Well, natural, by the way, I'll just go ahead and take that off there. How many climate change disasters there are. It doesn't matter how many people die. It doesn't matter how obvious it is. It is going to be something that they're going to keep kicking down the road because it will hinder their profits. It will hinder their ability to make money. And we should have already been off of fossil fuel. But the fossil fuel industry, which, by the way, according to my research, I'm trying to remember if it was the 60s or the 70s. They knew that climate change was real back then. And instead of like changing course, they just put all their money in PR and funding alternative experts. But we should be off fossil fuel already. We should have already figured this thing out, but we haven't. But capitalism is not going to solve climate change. It'll profit off climate change. That's what capitalism does. And by the way, it'll profit off all of the wars and all of the detention centers that are built and all of the things that are going to spring up. Disaster capitalism. That's what will take place. But they're not going to fix it. We're not going to fix it by doing just our particular consumer dances. We have to start putting actual pressure on the nation states in order to get corruption out of there, capital out of there, and start actually addressing the problem, unfortunately. Janica, love the Bourbon talks. Well, thank you, Janica. That's nice of you. Question: the GOP legislative assault on abortion access and human social rights for LGBTQ, especially transgender people, is coordinated and astroturfed by and for a small group of people. Absolutely it is, and that is the biggest story that nobody talks about at all. They have no interest in talking about it, and this is one of the things I will continue screaming from the rooftops until finally somebody talks to me about it. But it's not covered on TV. It's not covered in the major papers. It's exactly what's happening. You have a wealthy group of Republican donors who fund a bunch of think tanks and a bunch of these foundations. And what they do is they go ahead and they push this stuff in order to push the legislation that they want. Why is there no visible pushback in the streets? And where is everybody? Neoliberalism. On one hand, our media and our politicians don't talk about it. The Democratic Party won't talk about it. They have no interest in exposing the dark money than the organization that's a heart of it, because the Democratic Party has their own group of donors. They have their own group of think tanks and foundations that are absolutely trying to do similar things. They do not want to pull the curtain back and talk about corruption or capital and dark money in politics. They have no interest in it. Matter of fact, they have such little interest in it that Joe Biden, whose entire presidential agenda was stalled by neoliberals, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, who are owned by dark money in these special interests, instead of telling the story of why his agenda was sidelined and possibly, I don't know, keeping control of government and possibly his presidency, he would rather just be like, let's talk about something else. Don't worry about talking about why this has happened. Or possibly they don't even understand it. Or they want to deny it, which, by the way, a lot of our media and political class want to do. They want to pretend like this isn't actually happening, even though they all know it's happening. They don't want to pull the curtain back and tell you and tell me why this is occurring. But if you do even a little bit of cursory research, you will find that this is exactly how things work. This is how things happen. So why are we not in the streets? One, because our media and political class don't talk about this stuff. And two, neoliberalism has basically made us content to just hang out at home, play our game systems, and consume. You know, we had this movement, of course, with BLM, and we got in the streets and we protested for a while. And the media paid attention to it for a couple of days, and it was like, later, best of luck. It's really, really hard to get people out in the streets anymore. And it's really, really hard because mass politics has been completely depowered. And that was not by accident. That's what neoliberalism did. We absolutely should be out in the streets. We should have been out in the streets years ago. Years ago. Soup for my family. What a name. Would the Republicans in the red states be satisfied with a new Jim Crow era, no abortion, school censorship, or do they have national inspirations for these things? Both. If push came to shove, they're totally fine with having a balkanized system of government in which red states operate in one way and blue states operate in another. It's been really, really aggressive in terms of creating this situation that they can dominate. National politics has been absolutely depowered, and now local and regional and state politics is where power actually resides. If push comes to shove, they would be more than happy to just kind of have this on their side, but they also own the judicial branch, and they more or less have control over the Senate because of what the founding fathers created in terms of minoritarian institutions, and also not to mention the Electoral College. So there's that. But they have very very large national ambitions. They want what Viktor Orban has in Hungary. They want what Vladimir Putin has in Russia. They want to have elections that are rigged but look legit. They want to have a system of law that is completely written to their whims and in pursuit of the world that they want. They want an educational system that is not only privatized, but privatized in order to indoctrinate people and make them less questioning of everything. They have national ambitions, and they are hoping that the tide will turn. And again, it possibly could in regards to what happens. And as the American empire starts to fall apart, if all of a sudden we go down this masculinity, national Christianity, national conservative militaristic route. They're waiting for things to sort of shift in order for that regional balkanized idea to move up to the national sphere. And by the way, I mean, they could get it. That's a very real thing. They could absolutely get it. Juxtapose GOP. Did a screenshot of a question on Twitter. That was smart. Gets a couple extra words in there. That was smart. Juxtapose GOP. So many insisted for years that the GOP didn't really want to overturn Roe because it's a voter turnout tactic. Then I kept hearing GOP will deflect blame on courts for overturning Roe, yet GOP lawmakers all over are actively passing anti-abortion laws in anticipation of Roe being overturned. So what gives? Was it all a lie we told ourselves? Are there other white lies that will prove untrue, like Social Security being saved, too many older, consistent voters depend on it, or that amending the Constitution take away women's, gay, trans, people of color's rights is too difficult to process by design? Give me some hope here. Okay, a couple of things. We have seen a major shift within the Republican Party. And again, going back to my definition of neoliberalism, there were a lot of neoliberals in the Republican Party. I mean, the majority of them at some point were neoliberals. It has grown more and more extreme and tacked further and further into authoritarianism until now the nascent movement is this authoritarian, Orbanistic, Putinistic movement. So in the past, the neoliberal Republicans were, they were more than fine to just sort of like, chip away at women's rights and, try and create a patriarchal society, or at least move it in a certain direction. Ronald Reagan famously said he wasn't getting rid of Roe v. Wade. That was absurd. This new group is different. This new group is very, very ideological, and they have plans that move way beyond whatever somebody like a Mitch McConnell had any interest in. Mitch McConnell kind of wanted to move the country back a little bit, definitely, created more neoliberalism in order for, wealthy white people to be in charge. He probably wanted to get back around like the 1950s, like more sort of a white supremacist society. These people are on a different plane. I mean, they really, really, truly are. They will absolutely go after Social Security. They will absolutely go after Roe v. Wade. They'll go after voting rights. They'll go after speech rights. They'll change the entire Constitution and create like a Christian democratic society like what Viktor Bourbon has. These people are real deal neo-fascists. They are real deal. So none of this stuff is safe. And the neoliberals within the Republican Party have created a perfect game board for them to come in and exert minoritarian rule and basically take neoliberalism and turn it into just an absolutely twisted dystopia. The hope is that they are really unlikable people. Like they're really, really anti-charismatic, plus also just really, really gross people. And these conspiracy theories that they're spreading are absurd on their face. The rhetoric that they push is absolutely absurd. I'm sorry, but Tucker Carlson is a fish stick heir who's talking about real men. It's absurd. So the hope is that we can defeat them. We just have to come up with an alternative. That's what we got to do, and we got to work on that. Got to work on it in a hurry. Laura Wiley Haynes, what are the psyops targeted towards left-wingers? We see the QAnon and anti-mask and trucker ops for what they are, so what are we unaware of that's being pumped into our side, naive to think it isn't happening too? So, going back to what I said earlier, we have liberals and we have the left. And let's go ahead and sort of address both of these in different ways. The left is essentially powerless. There's not a whole lot of appealing to them in general. Leftist ideas are more or less a third rail of politics. American politics is no longer centered in the center of an axis, and over here is the left, and over here is the right. It has moved so far right that what we consider the left now, in some countries, is more or less just centrist. Like the idea that, oh my God, gay people should be allowed to vote. Like that shouldn't even be a thing that has to be argued about. That should just be center of the line. Yeah, of course they should be able to vote and marry and have equal rights. So the left more or less has been completely depowered. There's no real thing anymore as a leftist movement. I mean, you had the Bernie movement for a while, which still has some power, but even that is just kind of a center left movement. There are, within the left, there are so many disagreements about power and reality. One of the things that I think that the left struggles with is it really wants to focus completely on economics, and it never wants to address white supremacy or patriarchal power. As a result, the message sort of gets lost. We can't possibly talk about racism. We can't possibly talk about sexism. Everything is economic. Well, guess what? The economic idea, the material ideas are all wrapped in together. They're all part of it. Oh, yeah, and the Democratic Party has been dominated by neoliberals. Absolutely. Yeah, so the so-called left at this point is just human rights. It's people should have rights. In terms of liberals, in terms of what we would call sort of centrist, center left, and center right, again, it's sort of the people who still, are pretty much interested in the system being run the way that it is. The misinformation that's being peddled is what we've been talking about tonight, which is a complete concealment of how things actually work in this country, and the fact that the Democratic Party moved into neoliberalism starting in the 1980s and particularly in the 1990s. The idea that Joe Biden is some sort of fire-breathing leftist, or that him getting elected was going to change everything, which is something that I continually told people, like, this isn't going to happen. Joe Biden, particularly in the 1990s, was one of the people who helped construct this neoliberal mass incarceration and security state. Like, he's not going to come in and be a transformative figure. He's not going to come in and be FDR. But we're also told this sort of complete misinformation fantasy that everything's fine. Like, Donald Trump was the problem, and he's out of office, and he's ridiculous, and everything's fine now. Republicans are going to wake up tomorrow, and they're going to be totally fine. Democrats, they really, really care about the right things, and if only they had enough votes, they'd do this. No, there has to be a complete refoundation of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, for a very long time, worked on behalf of labor, minorities, vulnerable populations. That's where the power base came, and they actually challenged power. But all that changed in the 1980s and 1990s. And you now have a group of people in the Democratic Party who say, the things that you might want to hear. They're not going to come out and say the racist, sexist, awful, homophobic things, but they're also not going to do much to fight for those people's rights, right? They're not going to, pass some kind of law that will protect Roe v. Wade. They're not going to protect people's voting rights. They're not really interested necessarily in investing a lot of things. They have fiscal conservatism to worry about. That's the large part of the disinformation. Like the left, right, red, blue spectrum that we've all been taught is not true whatsoever. We are very much a rightward leaning society because all of this has been hidden from us and mistold to us. I will also say, and this is one of the reasons I was very happy that you asked this question, there are a lot of Democratic supporting donors who are continually pumping money into a lot of these foundations, a lot of these think tanks, a lot of these organizations, and they are trying to affect politics in a way that the Republican donors are. It just so happens that they're not necessarily inherently authoritarian, and they're not these aggressive sort of anti-government people. They kind of want to grow government to a certain extent. I will also say that in the past, I'm trying to think about how to word this the right way. In the past few months, I have had conversations with people who are Democratic donors and Democratic heavyweights, And they basically walk around. They're like, yeah, you can't trust the voter. You can't trust the regular person. They don't know what's good for them. We have to create propaganda. We have to create a system of misinformation. I've had conversations with people who are like, you know what the Democrats need? They need a democratic QAnon. That's what will fix things. And I've even had people who have talked about actively creating that and asked if I was interested in even engaging in something like that, like really disturbing things. And the entire point of all of this is to point out that just because people are on your side doesn't mean that you fundamentally agree on much, or that the way you see the world is even remotely related. The entire point of what I'm saying is that wealth basically runs our politics, and that's on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, which is one of the reasons why we need a fundamental grassroots movement that would fix things, that would actually call into question dark money and corruption in politics. Has to happen. But absolutely, there's misinformation all over the place. It has more or less become almost it's almost become an arms race between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of who can spread the best information and the best propaganda, or the best misinformation, I guess you could say. And a lot of people simply believe, unfortunately, that the system will hold. The system, never ever question the system. Don't worry, Donald Trump's going to be let out in handcuffs tomorrow. Robert Mueller will arrest him tomorrow. There's all these ideas that is, if we can just get Donald Trump out of the system, if we can just get him arrested, everything will be fine. And that's why I always say, and I try and say in every live stream I do, Donald Trump is not the disease, he's a symptom. The entire point of what we're talking about here are there are larger problems that have been around for a very, very long time. So there's a ton of misinformation in liberal circles, a ton of misinformation in Democratic circles, just like there's a ton of it in Republican and right-wing circles. But the left more or less isn't an active movement in American politics. Steve asked, do I have any hope for the prospect of a left or a Democratic third party? I don't know. I really, truly don't. I think the next generation has such little trust in our parties that there's always a chance that that something like that might shift. I mean, I think the next generation is very much on the left, and so we're going to see something that shifts in the near future, particularly again as climate change rears its head. Because a lot of us right now, we're going to see it as we get older. I'm a 40-year-old man. Like, I'm already seeing climate change ravage the planet, but you know, I'm not going to be alive like when it's like a hellstorm. Knock on wood. But you know, the descendants down the road, they're going to have to deal with this stuff, and they take it seriously. All right, we got 2 more questions, and then we'll finish this thing up. Moo Young, hi. What are your thoughts on the Air Force's new policy in support of personnel and families affected by the anti-LGBTQ legislation? The U.S. military does have a history of being on the forefront of certain social reforms, like desegregation, has a huge amount of influence. It has and it hasn't. At times, it's actually gone ahead and desegregated and then resegregated. Of course, you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was seen as progressive for a minute, even though it's like oppressive and progressive. A large part of what's happening right now is that the military and the system of the United States, it has realized that it has to start welcoming in more people and becoming more multicultural and more accepting, because that they have to bring in more people. Not many people won't go in the military necessarily. It's always preyed upon poor people, and particularly poor people of color. But now they also need like skilled people. And this is one of the reasons why you see the CIA putting out commercials where it's like, you know, a young woman of color talking about how she has like anxiety disorder and imposter syndrome. They want really, really badly to go ahead and bring these people in. And that goes back to this sort of a liberal concept, which is the idea that the system works if only the right people are in charge of it. You know, we don't really deal with the fact that the system is racist, sexist, classist, and it's designed to be like, you know, lorded over by an elite few. it needs real radical change. But the military, it doesn't really want any part of this stuff. It needs all the people that it can possibly get, particularly as American empire starts to decline. And how Todd asked how the authoritarian regimes in red states are going to be okay as long as they have military bases in them. Well, they're going to have militias. They're going to have their own groups of people who are going to take care of this. And of course, there are going to be people within the military and law enforcement who are going to side with them, or at least feel like they're part of the same project. But yeah, the military has no ability whatsoever to let this stuff go. They have to bring in as many people as they possibly can. And the worse that things get, and the more as American empire declines, they gotta push that. So you are going to see some things, because liberalism is about tolerance, particularly as tolerance pushes the system forward. All right, last question. First one, Snarky Yeti, what a name, says, can you tell us a bit about your current research and writing? Yeah, I got a book coming out in January called The Midnight Kingdom. We have a subtitle, by the way. I think we've decided on a subtitle. So pre-orders are going to start here soon. It's The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. And it starts in Rome, and it starts with the Roman Empire merging with Christianity in order to create a new power base and mythology, and that would change the course of the world. So it goes from ancient Rome all the way up to the war in Ukraine. It traces conspiracy theories that have been used to protect power, to expand power, white supremacy, and exploitation. And it goes throughout the history of feudalism, kingdoms, and then into liberalism and capitalism, the battle between liberalism and conservatism, and basically explains how we've arrived at this moment, and why there's a coming crisis that we're all more or less going to live through. So that's the book that's getting ready to come out. I think I know what the next book's going to be. I have an idea. I'm starting to put together the details on this. When I finally get this thing proposed and possibly get this signed somewhere, I'll tell you all about that. But I'm really, really excited about the possible next book. In the meantime, I'm working on the editing and proofreading of the next book, and I'm working on some fiction right now. For the fiction, it's a novel, and Carolyn, I talked about Ukraine earlier. I think the work. I'll talk about the novel. I'll tell you what the novel is about here in just a second. I think what's going to happen in Ukraine is that this war is going to continue on until it spills over into a larger problem that is going to be sort of the crisis. I think it's just going to continue to boil and boil and boil. Even if Russia succeeds, and even if Russia leaves Ukraine, I think this is going to be. We're going to look back on this, and we're going to say this is the beginning of a big, big problem. Oh man. So, the novel, I'll leave that. I'll leave that alone for a while. We'll talk about that another time. But I'm pretty excited about that. The new book comes out in January. In the meantime, Muckrake Podcast coming out on Tuesday. Another episode for patrons. Go over to patreon.com/Muckrake Podcast. That'll come out next Friday. I'll have another article over on dispatches from a collapsing state. And probably going to do another audio episode on that. Always enjoy doing those things. Thank you all for coming and hanging out. I really, really appreciate you. Cheers to defeating fascism and authoritarianism and a better future. Cheers. All right, everybody. Be safe. Let's do this again here soon, yeah?